So, good evening, City of Manteca, and welcome to the first ever budget town hall with the City of Manteca. So, for tonight's agenda, just going to quickly review it. We're going to give a brief welcome and introduction. We're going to talk about the city's budget mindset. We're going to clean up any rumors that might be out there. We're going to talk about accountability with the City of Manteca. We're going to talk about budget basics, the general fund, Measure M, utility enterprise funds, and how we plan to overcome some of the challenges that the city is facing. So with that being said, I would like to start with the introduction and welcome. And so first, I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Tony Lundgren, and I am currently serving as the City of Manteca interim city manager. And I also have with me this evening Jared Hansen, who is the deputy director of our finance department, who will be helping me with the presentation today. So a couple ground rules. We want this to be an interactive presentation tonight. So if you are not here present and you have questions and you are on the webinar, please feel free to ask questions. And at the end of the presentation, we will be answering those questions for you. So with that, we're going to jump in with a quick video that we would like to share on the city's, we call it Budget 101 here with the City of Manteca and how our budget operates. So we're going to start with that first.
A city's budget is all about connecting people with the services they need and want. As one of the 30 fastest growing cities in California, keeping up with Manteca's growth requires a well thought out plan, a highly skilled workforce, and an accessible and transparent city government that prioritizes accountability. The budget process supports all three of these objectives. The budget process focuses on personnel, operations, and infrastructure planning. It looks like this. The city has just under 500 full-time and about 300 part-time employees, delivering services ranging from recreation to water services, public safety to parks maintenance, along with millions of dollars in public infrastructure projects. To support accountability, the city categorizes revenues in buckets, or funds based on laws regulating each revenue. Revenues can be divided into two main categories, general and restricted. All general revenues go into the general fund, which pays for services everyone can use, like police, fire, and parks. Here are some examples of revenues in the general fund. For every dollar spent on taxable goods, the city receives 1 penny in sales tax. For every dollar residents pay in property taxes, the city's general fund only receives 14 cents. The rest goes to the county, school district, and other agencies. The general fund pays for 91 police, 34 fire, and 98 full-time employees in other departments. Restricted revenues, on the other hand, are regulated by law to be spent on specific goods and services. For example, water fees can only be spent on water services and maintenance. Another example is Manteca's public safety sales tax that pays for 18 fire and 18 police personnel, which is almost 20% of all public safety personnel. To recap, 1, the budget is about people. 2, the budget must be balanced, meaning revenues must equal or exceed expenses. 3, each fund controls personnel, operations, and infrastructure costs. 4, the general fund pays for general services that everyone can access. And 5, restricted funds can only be used for a specific purpose. Manteca is your city. Make a difference in its future by being involved.
So we're going to jump right into our presentation. So that was a recap of, very quick recap of our budget process, but we're going to talk a little bit more about it in depth. So with that, I'm going to start with our budgeting mindset here at the city of Manteca. So how do we care for the whole community? The city of Manteca is a full service city. We have 12 departments that serve the residents of the city of Manteca. So we have the city manager's office, the city attorney's office, city clerk team, community development or development services, an engineering department, a finance department, fire department, human resources, IT and information technology, our police department, public works, and recreation and community services, serving all of you. And so over the past couple years, between different media sources, whether it be social media, local newspaper, there's kind of been some rumors out and about. And so a couple of things that we thought it might be a good thing to do is clarify with our residents. And so between the deputy finance director and myself, we're going to be explaining some of these rumors that we have seen over the past couple of years. So I'm going to pass it off to Jared.
Yeah, so the first rumor that we keep hearing a lot is that the city is missing $60 million. And this rumor is false. The city is not missing money. It has never been missing. It's just in misreading the financial statements because the funds were sitting with the bondholders. This money, if it were missing, you would see lots of people with three-letter acronyms showing up: the CIA, the FBI, the SEC, so on and so forth. There'd be lots of lawsuits and lots of investigations. None of that is happening. There is no missing money. So again, that rumor that the money is missing is absolutely false.
Then another rumor that we've heard, or is the city ever going to expand transparency or provide more resources to the public? So yes, we are. We've been working on that diligently over the past year or so. And tonight's town hall is an example of that. The video is an example of that. So we've expanded more education through social media, community meetings, and we are also looking to be bringing to council in the next couple months a financial software that the public will have a public portal online that the public will be able to go in and look at our budget more in depth and find out more information. So there's a lot going on here so that we can show our residents what's going on here at City Hall and be transparent.
Yeah, and in addition, we've also added the financial documents to the finance website that shows all the budget details and documents, as well as updating all of the audit requirements well to provide that additional transparency and accountability.
You're up next. Oh, the next one is my utility rates, are they going to go up? And so I guess at this time I'd say maybe, but generally speaking, in the future, yes, they will. Rates here have not been increased in many, many years, depending on what service we're speaking to, whether it be water, sewer, or solid waste. Our fees here haven't been increased in many, many years. Right now, we are doing studies on the future of our infrastructure. And so at some point, this will be brought forth to the residents. And we do plan on doing some educational workshops, outreach, so that by the time that this does come to the residents, that everyone is well aware of what's going on. But it is something that we're working here at City Hall to plan for the future.
And Tony, as we start going through this presentation, and the public, as we start going through this, you're going to see part of the reason why we're talking about utility rate increases and the need for those rate increases as we get through some more of the presentation here tonight. Question number 4, or the rumor number 4, is that there's a new sales tax measure would prevent service reductions. And the answer to this is maybe. This is because when you look at the current levels of operations, we are currently able to fund current operations, which means that in the future, as costs go up and as we try to expand services, there just is not room in the general fund for that to happen. So the question then becomes, what happens if costs continue to increase, but we don't have those services? Well, we then have to start looking at cuts to services. We have to look at how are we going to take care of covering those additional costs that are coming in. You look at personnel costs are going up dramatically every year. You look at the retirement costs, they're going up dramatically every year, the health insurance costs, even just the cost of replacing roads is going up significantly each year. And as those costs go up, our revenues are not going up with those. Again, we're going to show you a little bit more of that as we get into the presentation a little bit more. Number 5 is the city waste money on consultants instead of doing the work itself. And again, this is a false rumor that's out there. Most of the time when we use consultants, it's because we're redirecting staff costs from actually providing services to actually and reducing their capacity to provide those services to a consultant that can do it even more efficiently, more effectively, and more timely. Because as the cost, as we know, staff here is very limited on what we're able to do and accomplish in a certain time frame. So the use of consultants helps to increase that capacity and provide that extra work that we simply don't have capacity to do. I mean, a good example of this would be we have used consultants to pay for and construct the Union 120 interchange. We don't have city staff that can construct that bridge itself. So we use those consultants and those construction costs in order to cover that work itself so that we don't waste that money on trying to hire and train construction workers and bridge builders to build that bridge interchange. We just don't have the capacity or the resources to be able to do that as a city. So as we talk a little bit further about the budget process and about accountability, how do we measure that? Well, it starts with our budget process. And this is where the council, the community, and the staff get involved. And we start with the budget process through the development and the adoption process. This is working with the council to develop goals and objectives, to talk about their priorities for the upcoming year. Once those are done, we work through with each of the departments to talk about what are their needs, how do they meet the needs and the priorities the council has set for us. And then as finance, we come together and say, how do we make that work? And we work through that process to propose a budget. That budget goes through multiple different revisions until ultimately it's presented to council in a workshop. That workshop then gets us feedback on that budget, and we determine any changes that need to happen to that budget at that time. We go back and work on it in the finance department again, talking with the different departments about things that are happening and the recommendations from council. And we bring back a final budget. That budget's what's adopted at council, and that was what was adopted about 2 weeks ago. That we adopted that budget for the fiscal year 23 that we're talking about today. As we continue through the fiscal year, we have the operations, we have the capital projects, we have things that are going on through that particular year, and we spend the money, we look at what's going on, we look at the projects, we get all the revenues, we get the expenses, we pay for what we need to. At the end of that fiscal year, we go through an audit. That audit is for a couple of purposes. One is to provide that assurance to the public that the funds are being spent appropriately. The other one is also because we have single audit requirements. The single audit is a requirement from the federal government that says if we receive more than $750,000 in funds from a federal source, so any of our transportation money, we have a lot of housing money that comes in, we have a lot of police and law enforcement money that come in from a federal source. Those are audited separately, and a different report is issued called the single audit. That's how the city measures accountability in its process. And as you probably know, we are working on our audits to get those up to date, and currently in the process of getting close to the fiscal 21 audit being completed. So we're working on that as we speak. It's a big goal for us. So when we do this whole process, we come up with what's in the city's budget or what we're coming up with. So again, in November through June, we're going through that council cycle to talk about the objectives and priorities, get input, talk about our analysis of where we're going to end the year, come up with different revenue projections to come up with how much revenue we're going to have for the year. We come up with a budget narrative, city profile that talks about the different policies of the city that help us as we implement the objectives of council and as we move forward with our spending. We also talk about each of the different departments and talk about what's going on in those departments and major initiatives in those departments. And we have the financial section that talks about each fund or each bucket of revenue that we have that's coming in, as well as how that's being spent and how it's being allocated out. That's also broken down by department, And then it shows you also by personnel, operations, capital, how much is for debt, how much is for transfers between different funds. And then also in the budget is the staffing levels, which is the authorized number of positions, as well as the funding for those particular positions. So what does the budget actually tell? Well, if you look at the circle here on the left, what you're seeing is you're seeing the different types of funds that we have. We have the general fund, which is the general bucket. We have specific special revenue funds that are used because they come from a specific revenue source and are restricted for specific purposes. We have the enterprise fund, your utilities funds, your water, your sewer, your solid waste, and then we have other types of funds. That's the story that the budget talks about, is how each of those funds are, how each of those buckets are going to be spent. When we look at the right side, we look at some of the revenues that are coming in, or the income that's happening. That's through taxes. So your property taxes, your sales tax. We look at different fees. So these would be development fees. These would be fees that you pay for uh, other types of things that are happening, fingerprinting fees, different things like that. And then you look at service charges coming in. These would be your utilities coming in. And these are not proportional by any means. So don't think that this is the proportional. This is just the example of kind of where they're coming from. But you have your service charges that are coming as well. On the opposite side, we have the expenses, or the what's going out for the year. These expenses are generally related to personnel, operations, and capital. And the personnel is, people and the staff that we have. Operations are the general day-to-day things, as well as office supplies, different contracts, the computers, all those different equipment and needs. And then our capital side is where we look at the different improvement projects that are coming in, those larger projects that take generally more than 1 year. In that budget process, you'll notice this looks like a scale. We have to balance that process. And when we balance revenues and expenses, or revenues are greater than expenses, then we have a balanced budget. And that's what we try to strive for each year, is a balanced budget where our revenues either meet or exceed the need for the expense side. So as we look at the adopted budget for fiscal 23, what you'll see is the general fund has a positive net balance, or that very bottom number that you see on the screen here, of $541,000. All the other funds are lumped together into one as a $26 million net positive coming in. What this means for the general fund is, if you look at that positive number at the bottom, that 541,000 is our wiggle room if we've made an error, or if we've projected things wrong. And we hope that we haven't, because that's the goal, right? You don't want to make mistakes on budget, but budget's never perfect, because as soon as you adopt it, something changes and your assumption changes. I mean, what happening with gas prices is a great example. You never know what gas prices are going to be from one day to the next. One day it could be $5.50 if you're lucky, right? And the next day it'll be $6 at that same gas station. And the next day after that, it'll be $5.90. And you're like, what happened? Why does it change every day? Well, that's exactly what's happening in our budget. Things change on a constant basis. This is a point in time as to what the plan is in our spending plan for the year. That number at the bottom, that 541,000, that only represents a 0.7% wiggle room. So if we're off by 0.7%, then we start on our expenses. Our expenses are higher because gas is higher. Our revenues are lower because we made too high of projections. That means we're in a deficit balance. And so we have to come up with that deficit from somewhere. So as we look at the budget as well, we look at those positions and say, how many positions? And this shows you the different positions from one fiscal year to the next. We only increased 2 positions in the budget this year. One in the city manager's office for the homeless and housing manager, and one in public works for a streets worker, if I remember right, a streets worker. But again, we have to include those costs in the different budget. And again, we're looking at the cost of the budget and what's there. We have a very small margin of reserve that's available at the end of the fiscal year in order to fund additional positions. So we have to really take that step back and say, can we really afford this? And what do we need to hold off on? And how do we provide that service? And how do we make sure that things are working, overall for the city? So as we look at the general fund itself, and we look at the trend for the general fund, you'll notice over the past couple of years, yes, there's been a good, different increase in balance. And then you see the fiscal 22 where we adopted a budget where we had planned some deficit spending. We didn't know the full impact of COVID. We didn't have the uh, staffing in finance had turned over. Actually, staffing in the city has turned over quite a bit as well. So there's not some of that institutional knowledge. We're trying to put pieces back together. We kind of planned for that, knowing that there might be some use of our reserves in order to cover that fund balance deficit for the year. But where does it all come from? This is again general property taxes, your sales taxes, your business licenses, and it pays for your police, your fire, your streets, your parks, as well as all those other city departments. As we continue looking at the general fund, some of the things to notice is that we do have a strong growth in our sales tax, and that has continued to increase as time has gone on. And it's actually increased more than generally what we have projected because we're conservative in our revenue projections usually. It's usually increased a little bit more above that. A lot of that's due to the inflation. But as we know, we're hearing rumors and talks of potential recession coming up. So what does that look like and how do we account for that and be conservative in our estimates so we're not overinflating what we think we're going to get in, but we're not under inflating what we know we're going to come in. So again, as we look at those different things, we also have to look for that long-term financial stability and how do we sustain the current level of spending, but still provide the services to the city that we need. And so again, one of the ways that we do that is through the use of our reserves, or what we call the fund balances. And when you look at the fund balances from the fiscal 2020 audited balances, there is only $9 million worth of fund balance that is not already restricted for another purpose. That's not a lot considering that when you look at fiscal stability, there's 13 million there. That represents 30% of operating expenditures in 2021. So when you look at that and you say, okay, if that's 30%, well, how does that equate to unassigned operations? Well, we know we're getting revenues in and we know we're going to replenish that, but are we going to have enough and how do we maintain that? The other thing to talk about when you talk about fund balance in the general fund, especially, is this is the only fund that can be used to cover other funds if there's deficits and if there's deficit spending in those funds. So when you take that $9 million and you look at deficits in other funds and you say, how do we cover those deficits? That $9 million actually gets eaten up very quickly. There is actually about $11 million in deficits in other funds, which we'll get to here in just a little bit. And how do we cover those funds and how do we maintain the long-term stability of those particular funds as well? Well, general fund's the one to cover it. And if we only have 9 million left, then how are we going to cover it? That's the question that everybody's asking. There's a lot of this assigned to different things, as you see, technology, capital reserves. We have pension amounts, we have economic funds and facilities funds as well. Those all get funded through reserves of operations as there's sufficient fund balance, except for things like economic revitalization, which is provided by a supplemental sales tax or supplemental property tax from the former RDA agency. Those get funded, and then the public facilities get funded through a business license tax on construction of residential dwelling units up to a certain dollar amount. So those get funded and replenished fairly quickly and fairly frequently every year, but the rest of them are based on what we project operating expenses to be for the upcoming year. So again, this particular fiscal year, 2020, we had enough in our fund or our reserves to be able to cover all those costs, as well as having some of the reserves. Next one we want to talk about is a little bit about Measure M. This is the public safety sales tax. It's the 0.5% transaction use tax. This pays for police and fire staffing. And again, as you saw in the video, there's 18 police and 18 fire. And again, because of strong growth in recent sales tax, you'll notice that sales tax trend has continued upward every year. And we do have sufficient reserves in this to meet the 50% reserve requirement that's there. Again, as we're talking about adding new public safety officers, either police or fire, the question from this one becomes, how long can we sustain this and how long can we sustain that growth with the current inflation, knowing that the recession also is coming up?
And just one thing to add to this, half-cent sales tax passed in 2006 by the voters. And we are very, very fortunate to have this because, as you can see, it funds a tremendous amount of public safety positions for our city, which is really, really important. So we're very lucky to have it.
Now, when we start looking at some of the enterprise funds or your utility funds, this is where you'll see first the water fund. The water fund, again, residential and commercial service fees on this one to pay for the water treatment and distribution. Again, probably the first numbers that you look at are, oh, every year is negative except for 2021. Why is 2021 different? In 2021, there was a settlement that was paid to the city for treatment of the water, and we received the settlement money there. So that number is overinflated essentially for the year because that's a one-time revenue that came in. When you look at the deficits for each year, you're looking at, $2 to $7 million deficit every single year. That's going to eat into your reserves. As of right now, when you look at the reserves are sufficient to meet our reserve requirement of 25%. But again, as we start talking about, okay, but if you're using 2 to 3 million to 4 to 7 million of that every year, that's not sustainable in the long term, which again brings us back to the how do we look at rates to continue to maintain that so we can bring that number from a negative to a positive number each year or a close to zero. Because again, as you're talking water, we're providing that service should be able to cover itself. And again, we're going to look at sewer. Same type of situation happened with sewer. There is a big drop in one of those years because there was a major capital improvement project that was planned for the year that finally got funded and is being worked on. And we're excited about that. But again, that's going to be the use of reserves because those funds, again, as you start looking at those, is how do we maintain that long-term sustainability of that to maintain that long-term solvency. Again, sewer is used to operate and regulate anything that comes into the sewer plant and treats that so that it's then viable at a later time. There is one more thing on that one. There is a lot of restricted fund balance on that one or restricted reserve. That's because most of the majority of that restricted or that reserve is related to the investments that we've made in the capital improvements. So that's your operating plans, things that you actually can't spend money on because it's not available for you to spend. Then we look at solid waste. Again, this is for your garbage, your recycling, your yard waste, your organics. Again, the big question on this one is how do we solve this long-term insolvency issue? When you start looking at the past trends, again, we're looking at deficits, $1 million to 4 or 5 million. And overall, this particular fund, the 25% reserve requirement is not met because it's in a negative unrestricted position. If we were to make it meet the fund balance requirement that we're striving for without any rate increases, that means that the enterprise funds need to have, or at least for solid waste, needs to have a subsidy come from the general fund of about $9 million in order to cover that. And again, we saw in a couple slides previous that the general fund has an unrestricted reserve balance of about $9 million. So what does that mean? That means general fund would cover all of solid waste, but again, it's not been authorized by council to cover this balance with that yet. So we have to talk about how do we solve this problem? How do we continue to make solid waste sustainable as the cost of garbage is doubled and tripled over the past couple of years?
Yeah, and so this particular enterprise fund, we are doing an updated fee study, which we will be bringing to council in months to come. And one thing I'd also like to highlight is the state is also imposing new regulations on solid waste requirements, and it's called the Senate Bill 1383. So beyond some of the challenges that we're facing here at a local level, the state is also imposing some other challenges that we are planning for as well in our updated fees. So
And especially when you talk about organics recycling and the food waste, and how do you take that food waste and separate it from everything? When you talk about the cost of recycling costs have gone way up, and how do you recover those costs as well? And there's There's very little at the city that we recycle in our normal blue recycle bins because the cost of recycling everything else is just not sustainable for what we have. Yet we have a mandate to be able to provide recycling services. So how do you balance the mandates that we have both from a state and federal level to providing those services as well? That's something you look at when you talk about the insolvency and how do we fund those mandates.
So just to wrap up before we open up for any questions anyone here in the audience might have, or if anyone's on the webinar, as you can see, we really wanted to be transparent and kind of open up to our community what's going on here at City Hall with our finances. And obviously, I think if you've been part of watching this presentation, you'll see that the city definitely has some challenges. And I would say the team here is we are working very hard to overcome those challenges. And I just want to highlight a few things that we're working on internally to put the city in a better position. So some of the things we've been doing is we've expanded our team to clean up our financial records, get our house in order, clean it up, get our audits back on track. So we're working diligently day and night to do that. We have taken a lot of time this past year to educate our council, our staff, and also our voters. This is one of the things we're trying to do is just really educate everyone that we can't continue to operate how we are operating. And, we actually have even been exploring the need for a potential sales tax measure to maybe help improve the quality of life here in our community. And then, as we both mentioned, Jared and myself, we're pursuing interim utility rates. Those are going to be coming to our residents for solid waste, water, and sewer. And we, over the past couple of years, have also been exploring augmented revenue plans. So ways that we can increase more revenue to provide better services to our residents. And some of the work that we've been doing is we have worked with City Council to approve a cannabis program, which we're hoping to launch in the next several months. We are bringing community facility district fee updates to council at our next meeting. We are exploring potentially increasing our transient occupancy tax. And we have incorporated a new short-term rental program where we are collecting revenue. So we are definitely looking for ways to increase revenues to provide better services. And I think one thing I would like to say from the city manager's office, I'm really passionate about getting our house here at the city of Manteca back in order, getting our finances caught up, and getting our organization, back on the map. So that's just a little bit about what we're doing. We didn't want to just bring a bunch of problems. We've got solutions, and we're working really hard to move the city into the future. So with that, I would like to start first with anyone here. If they would like to come up and ask us any questions, Jared and I would be happy to answer them. And then after that, we can open up to any questions that might be on the webinar. Does that sound good? So if either of you would like to come up, we would like to welcome you. Yes.
You have the
Hello,
camera
Mayor.
on? Is the camera on? All right.
And you have 3 minutes, right?
No, I do not have 3 minutes. I want to just say that I really compliment the staff. They have been working diligently, hard, many hours for a long time. And when I say a long time, I'm speaking of months and years to settle the accounts, determine why this community is so financially in poor shape, and more importantly, how to dig ourselves out of the hole that the past has been dug over the past decades. So they've been very careful in their wording tonight. They've been nice. I'm here to tell you how it is. The finances of this community is bad. It's poor. You cannot balance a budget every single year for decades and never have enough money to repair roads, to expand the library, to spend on other community amenities that are missing. So I'm going to tell you that, and they've been nice about it, but we are going to have to make some changes. And it's going to be a dramatic changes in the way how the city is financed, how the city operates with respect to revenue and expenses. And basically what that comes down to is that we have to raise fees. And you can call it taxes, you can call it whatever you want, but the city operates on fees, and those fees come in the form of taxes. And if we don't, as Jared pointed out, the cost of everything is going up. Our revenues are not going up proportionately, which means that somewhere down the road, another year, 2 or 3, we're going to be significantly out of balance, which means we're going to have to cut services. And when I say cut services, that means cut police, fire, parks, planning department. Every single department is going to get reduced in size. Services are going to decline. And for a community that's almost 100,000 people, that is not a good future outcome. We should be in a different place today, a different place that is prosperous, providing a quality of life that provides the amenities you expect from government, our government. So I'm here to tell you and be frank with you that if we don't get your help, all the work that these people here have been doing is for naught. Simple as that. If you have any questions, give me a call. I don't care what day or what time it is. I can help you find the answer. We have very knowledgeable people here that have the solution, and we are going to work on it and solve that problem. And it's not going to take 20 years. It's going to be done quickly, because we can't survive another 2 or 3 years with the revenue stream that we currently have and been operating for decades. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, come on up.
Good evening. I would like to ask you to please elaborate on the changes in the CFDs. And that's an acronym that many people are not familiar with. So if you could take a few moments to explain how that might change the future trajectory for our finances and our services, and how that relates to growth. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I can answer and you can chime in if you'd like. So what we are looking at is for new developments to tack on a fee to each of the homes that covers costs for, so we currently do this in several of our newer developments and our CFDs. So their community facility districts include fees for park maintenance, some of our wells, but the new study that we are bringing forth in July will also include costs for public safety. So that will be the new portion. So new homes that are built, they'll have fees that will be tacked on, yearly assessments that will cover parks and public safety. Do you want to add anything to that? But that is pending council's approval. So that will, the report will be brought forth at the July 19th meeting. There will be a presentation. It's just informational. And then from there, council will have an opportunity. The residents, you all can come join. If you want to see the presentation, you can ask any questions. And then depending on the consensus that we get that night from council will depend on if we approve it. And like I stated, new developments, they've already been approved for parks, but the new component we're looking to add is for public safety and roads, streets, so that we can continue to maintain those as our community grows into the future.
Yeah, and with a community facilities district, one of the purposes or ways to do it is that it's to benefit the residents of that particular community. And so the assessments on the homes in that particular community district to pay for those different types of services that would benefit them directly.
So with that, I would like to open up and see if we have any questions on the webinar.
There are no questions and there are no hands raised.
Okay. Well, with that being said, this is the end of our presentation. I'd like to thank you all who joined or tuned in. And if you have any other further questions, you can find my email on the city webpage or Jared's, and we are more than happy to answer any questions or provide any information that is requested. So thank you again and have a great evening.